Hey, this week let's talk about the Hall of Fame. So this week let's talk a little bit about the Hall of Fame. This weekend is the Hall of Fame virtual reality show. Friday night and Saturday night. It's going to be a pretty cool deal. We got all the videoing done a couple of weeks ago, and the boys have been editing and doing a fantastic job putting this together. It'll be a fun, entertaining show for everybody. Let's talk a little bit about our inductees this year. Some of you have heard of some of these guys, some of you haven't. Now, a lot of you know the Scott Hess history and story because of following my channel, but some of the other guys maybe you don't know a lot about. Mark Bendler had the Kodiak trucks, and the Kodiak trucks, you know, he started out right in the early days, and around 84 was the first time I seen the first Kodiak truck, and, you know, he did a lot of the big things in the beginning. You know, it was kind of a funny thing back in 84, 85, everybody was trying to see who could get bigger and bolder and heavier, and then all of a sudden, you know, in the late 80s is when, or the mid to late 80s is when they did the big switch. So a lot of people laughed and said Bob Chandler kind of helped steer that it was a switch and bait, got everybody building bigger and bigger, and then they come out with a lightweight race truck. But there was a lot of guys doing that. But Mark Bendler actually had several trucks through the years. He started out with the big heavyweight and had a lot of gearboxes, a lot of gearing, super heavy trucks, and I think it was 14 or 15 foot tall on the transport tire. I mean, it was, well, not on transport tires, but I know when he hauled it on the transport tires, he was as low as he could get on as low a trailer as he could get, and he was still barely clearing the 13.6 heights restrictions. So I think the story was somebody was supposed to get him a set of the 10-foot tall tires, and he built the truck to accommodate him, I think is what the story was. But then he started lightening the trucks up. He had a real lightweight leaf spring truck in those days when they lightened them up, and then just kept working up until he had a full-out race truck. The next guy we're going to talk about is Kevin Dabney. You know, the Dabney brothers were very instrumental way in the early days of monster trucks. The first time I seen Kevin Dabney's, one of his creations was at the 84 Jamboree, which was the Blue Thunder Camaro on crane tires. I'll never forget the story about them telling me about the crane tires. They got to the show and had no idea that the Terra tires were as light as they was. These guys all back then, we didn't have the internet back then, so a lot of times you had to either see something from a magazine, or you had to go from who you might know that's doing something, or you had to go to shows and learn. But I think Kevin told me back in those days that those crane tires weighed 3,800 pounds a piece, and I know that was a huge undertaking to put them on and off. But you know, the Camaro was really advanced at the time. That was in 84, and if you guys look back at pictures of the Camaro, it had a 4-link suspension, it had airbags, and he had took hydraulic cylinders with flow controls and created his own shock absorbers, which aren't too much different than what they're running today. When you think about how advanced he was back in 84 compared to everybody else with the big leaf springs and things. You know, and he ran Blue Thunder for a while, and then actually I think Kevin, or Kirk, his brother, twin brother Kirk, they were identical twins. If you hung out with them a little bit, you could tell the difference, but a lot of times guys would get them confused back in those days. But I think he kind of gave Blue Thunder to Kirk, and then Kevin built Megaforce, which was one of my all-time favorites. That thing was just, when you talk about excess, that was excess. That thing had the biggest leaf spring packs. It had just unbelievable. It had the top loader axles where, you know, they run a differential above the axle housing and tip the pinions up. He had a tilt body, tilt bed. I don't know how many shocks on it. It was insane how many shocks. Had twin engines and 80-inch tall tires. And it's just amazing the stuff that Kevin did back in the early days. And then even developed, you know, like my first war wagon truck actually had a set of his, what we called them corn picker shocks. They were a cylinder that was designed from a combine with a corn picker head. They used a one-way cylinder, and then he used some sort of an accumulator that came from a military application that was used for a starter. And they actually worked pretty good. There was not any valving ability, but they actually worked pretty good for an earlier style suspension truck. But Kevin also, him and Kirk were the first ones to figure out the Clark planetary combination, which is pretty much a standard now, but back in the day, they figured out that a 5-ton Rockwell axle, the inner axle shaft, would actually mate up to a Clark payloader steering knuckle axle shaft. They actually had them laying on the floor, and I think they were working on, the story that they told me, they was working on Blue Thunder. They had the axles out of it, and he was building Megaforce, and the axles were laying there, and I think Kirk hollered at Kevin for getting his axles into his mess or something back or forth, and they found out that actually those two axles, they had the ball and claw design, which would remind you of like this, and they would actually intersect, and they were actually the same ball and claw design, which kind of blows your mind. I mean, the Rockwell axle was a military application. The Clark planetary steering knuckle was also a military application, but it was a total different application. And that was a Clark, and this was a Rockwell. And for them to have intersecting axle shafts that would actually work together is just, I don't know if somebody actually, maybe the same engineer, helped do the engineering in both companies. It'd be interesting to find that out. One of the other guys that's getting inducted this year was Dave Marquardt, which from Excalibur. You guys have heard a lot of stories about Dave. He was early on an engineer that had computer technology at the work that he worked at, and he was able to do CAD design work, and they actually was able to take Excalibur, and they was actually able to put all the measurements in, and they could watch it through the CAD system to actually make suspension that worked. Excalibur, those guys were the hardest charging guys in the industry back in those days. I remember going to a show like in 86 or 87 where everybody was doing just a little wheelie on the cars and landing on the cars and driving off, and I remember seeing those guys coming up to the stack of cars, and they weren't slowing down. They just kept coming and coming and faster, and pretty soon they're accelerating, charging at the cars. And I remember when they hit them cars, they flew over the whole stack, and I just remember the whole audience going dead quiet. I mean, just so quiet. Everybody went and they waited till the truck bounced and landed and almost rolled over, and it came back on its wheels and spit and sputtered. They never had a lot of horsepower in the beginning, so they actually ran at the cars hard, because if they went up to them easy like everybody else did, they would have probably died. The carburetor would have probably fluttered and they'd have probably died. So they didn't want to be embarrassed, so those guys charged at them hard. And when Dave designed the new Excalibur race truck that he only drove, I think, once or twice, and he was a lunatic when he drove. I remember being at the first show that he drove that at. It was kind of a debut of it, and it was like, wow, this thing's going to be unbelievable. But Charlie Pauken, everybody knows, one of our Hall of Famers, Charlie Pauken, ended up taking over the driving duties, and eventually owned the team. But Dave Marquardt, unfortunately not with us any longer. But he set the bar super high. Him and Mike Nickel. So that's just kind of a little tidbit of what some of these guys did. I know it's been kind of interesting hearing some of the comments from different people saying that this is turning into a Thunder Nationals Hall of Fame, and it's not. Out of this group of guys, Kevin Dabney never ran with the Thunder Nationals. I think he he was with US Hot Rod in the early days. I think he ran with Rev, which a lot of guys have heard of Rev. I think he ran with him pretty much the whole last half of his career. And I think Mark Bendler might have ran a couple Thunder National events with Aaron Paulburn, but for the most part he ran with US Hot Rod. And and then of course Dave Marquardt, they ran with Aaron Paulburn, but of course Scott Hess did too. But actually Scott Hess never ran with the Thunder Nationals as Hercules. he actually ran as a barefoot, and that worked out pretty good once he got the barefoot deal. So hey, if you get a chance, go to the Monster Museum Facebook page and get logged in, or whatever you got to do to be able to watch this weekend's virtual video. Friday night we've got a video with some pretty cool announcements. Saturday night is the big night. I tell you what, I'm so excited right now about what's happening. We've got some huge announcements to make, and we've got some really neat surprises. And I just can't wait to see everybody's response on all this. And but it's been great. Thanks for watching us. Please watch and support the Monster Truck Hall of Fame. And we got a lot of exciting things coming in the future. So we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.